The airlock opened onto darkness and the smell of wet stone. Essie had been told to expect the low light. She had not been told it would feel like stepping into the inside of something, a chest, a held breath, the space between one word and the next. The corridor of Vorathsem stretched ahead of her, wide as a transit tunnel, its walls a dark mineral blue that absorbed more light than it returned. She stood still for a moment while her eyes caught up to what they were seeing. An attendant waited 4 meters ahead. Threnody, unmistakably. Tall, the joints of their limbs turned at angles that human anatomy declined to attempt, their skin a pale iridescent gray that moved slightly when they breathed, like the surface of still water touched by wind. This one was watching her with what Essie had learned from 6 weeks of preparatory briefings, to read as attention rather than evaluation. The Threnody did not evaluate quickly. They watched until they understood, and they only understood slowly, and they considered this a form of respect. Essie, the attendant said. The name sat in the word like a stone placed carefully on a table. Yes, she said, I'm Essie. I am Ovith, a pause, you will follow. She followed. The corridor curved not sharply but persistently, as though the station had decided on a direction and was committed to it without being in any hurry. Doors passed on both sides, sealed, no markings Essie could parse. Her footsteps made a flat sound on the floor. Ovith's made something she had no word for, a small resonance, like the beginning of a sound that chose not to finish. The welcome chamber was larger. Not large by any standard Essie associated with ceremony. It would have fit in a medium conference room at the UN building in Nairobi, had the ceilings been lower, but the space had weight. 18 Threnody stood in a loose arrangement that was clearly not random, though Essie could not have said what principle organized it. In the center of the room, a raised platform held a single object, a shallow bowl of dark water with something floating in it that she couldn't identify. Corvalon stepped forward from the arrangement. The ambassador. Essie had studied his photograph, which had not prepared her for him at all, because his photographs had been taken in environments lit for human cameras, and the compression of light into a flat image had lost whatever quality it was that made Corvalon read in person as extraordinarily calm. He spoke in Threnody first, then shifted to the standard that both delegations had agreed would serve as working language. His voice in standard was careful and precise, slightly formal, like a musician playing in a tuning they had mastered but not grown up with. We receive you, he said, in the manner of Vorathsem. He reached into the bowl and withdrew the floating object. A small carved weight, matte dark stone, shaped like nothing in particular, not an animal, not a symbol, not a geometric solid. It occupied its own category of shape. He placed it in Essie's open palm. The weight of it was actual, denser than she had anticipated for its size. She looked at it. She looked around the room, trying to read what was expected next, and found 18 faces watching her with the same quality of attention Ovith had shown in the corridor. She turned toward the low table at the edge of the platform, the obvious place to set something down. Ovith was beside her before she completed the turn, a hand very light on her wrist, not stopping her, simply present. As he stilled, she stood with the weight in her palm and did not put it down. After a moment, Corvalon continued speaking, moving into the formal address of welcome, and the ceremony proceeded, and Essie stood with the carved stone in her hand and did not understand what she had almost done. She asked afterward in the smaller room where Ovith had been assigned to brief her on protocol. She asked what the carved thing was called. Ovith was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone thinking of an answer, the quiet of someone deciding whether the question itself required a response. The word you are asking for, Ovith said, does not exist. What do you mean? Objects given in greeting do not have names. A pause. To name the thing that was given would be to, she made a gesture with 2 fingers that Essie could not read. To move it out of the time it was given in, it becomes a different thing. Essie looked at the weight in her pocket, which she had transferred there during the address without thinking. What happens if I had put it down? You did not. But if I had? Ovith considered her for a long moment, something that might have been recalibration moving behind her eyes. We would have continued, she said. We would have proceeded, but you would have returned the gift to the moment before it was given, and we would have known that you did not yet understand the weight of arriving. Essie thought about this. I still don't understand it, she said. Yes, said Ovith, but you understood that you didn't and you held the stone anyway. That is different. That night in the quarters assigned to her, which were comfortable in the way of a room designed by people who had read a thorough description of comfort without experiencing it personally, Essie sat on the edge of the sleeping surface and held the carved weight in both hands. She turned it. It remained what it was. She set it on the small surface beside the sleeping platform and then picked it up again and held it until she was ready to sleep. The weight of it was small. She would not understand what she was carrying for 3 more days. The conference chamber had no chairs. Essie had been told this in the briefing materials, had noted it, and had forgotten it in the way you forget practical things when you are carrying larger concerns. The room was circular, its ceiling lost somewhere above the reach of the low lighting, and the Threnody delegation stood in another of those arrangements that felt organized by a principle she couldn't name. Her own delegation, 2 aides, a legal analyst named Priya who had not slept enough, a translator they had not needed yet, stood in a rough cluster on the far arc of the circle. The accord itself existed as projected text, not on a screen, suspended in the air between the 2 delegations as columns of light, Threnody script running parallel to standard, both languages saying what 40 years of proxy conflict in the outer reach had produced, and what, in theory, this document was meant to end. 11,214 dead. A mining colony called Yanoba Station, whose name had meant something in the language of the West African cooperative that had funded the initial settlement. Before the resource rights dispute pulled 3 different powers into its orbit and turned it into a pressure point for 16 years and then an atrocity. Essie knew the name of the cooperative. She knew several of the names beneath it. She had read the accord in full on the journey out. She had read it 3 times. By the 3rd reading, she knew which clause was going to be the problem, and the clause was not the one her advisors had flagged. Corvalon gestured toward the signing surface, a shallow depression in what appeared to be a freestanding column of the same dark mineral as the walls, where a marking instrument waited, designed for hands of either anatomy. Essie stepped forward. She read the final clause again, in standard, though she had it well enough by then that she was not really reading. All grievances named herein are, upon signing, considered resolved. They shall not be spoken of, recorded further, or carried forward in any formal diplomatic context. She looked at the instrument in its shallow hollow. She set it back down. The silence was immediate, not the silence of offense. She had enough experience of negotiating rooms to know what offended silence felt like, the way it prickled and pulled toward confrontation. This silence was different. It was the silence of people watching someone do something they did not have a category for. Priya made a small sound behind her. Corvalon spoke, Envoy Essie. I can't sign the final clause, she said, not as written. He was quiet for a moment. The chamber was so still she could hear the faint hum of whatever kept Vorath-Sem in its orbit. The clause is not a negotiating element, he said finally. It is the function of the document. The accord does not exist without it. I understand that. Without the final clause, there is no accord. There is only a list of incidents. I understand that too. Another silence. Corvalon looked at her with the patient attention of his species, the attention that was not evaluation, that simply waited until understanding arrived. But this time there was something beneath it, not impatience, something closer to a very deep confusion. The clause asks you to lay the grievance down, he said. We have laid ours down. We ask only that both sides leave this room carrying the same weight, which is to say none. The families of Yanoba Station haven't been acknowledged by name, Essie said. 11,000 people. Before anything is laid down, their names belong in the record. To put their names in the record is to prevent the resolution from taking effect, the function of the accord. I know the function is to close the wound. Closing the wound, Essie said, is not the same thing as healing it. She heard Priya exhale behind her. Corvalon was very still. Around him the delegation was very still. The silence had texture now. It was not empty. It was full of something the Threnodi were collectively processing, something that required their whole attention. At the edge of the room, Oveth was watching her. Essie did not look directly at her. She felt the gaze the way you feel a presence in low light, more certain than sight. The ambassador spoke again, and his voice had shifted slightly, still careful, still precise, but something in it had changed. The quality of a musician moving from mastery into something closer to genuine feeling. Envoy, he said, what do you intend to do with the grief? Keep it, she said. The room went very still. Oveth walked at a pace that allowed for thinking, which was slightly slower than necessary, and Essie matched it without being asked. The lower corridor of Vorathsem at its equivalent of late evening was dimmer still than the rest of the station. The Threnodi dimmed their environments incrementally through what served as their daily cycle, and at this hour the walls gave off barely enough light to navigate by. Essie had been on the station for 3 days. She was beginning to see in it. They had not planned the walk. Oveth had appeared at the door of Essie's quarters with a covered container and a look that was neither invitation nor question. Essie had put on her jacket and followed, which felt like the right answer. They settled eventually in a recessed space off the main corridor, not a room exactly, more a deliberate widening, as though the station had decided at this point to provide for the possibility of stopping. There was a low surface. Oveth placed the container on it and opened it. Small cakes, dense, their surface a dark gray-green. The smell was something like earth after rain and something like nothing Essie had a word for. She ate one. It tasted of a long time passing. They sat in the dimness and Oveth did not speak immediately, and Essie did not speak either, and the silence between them was already different from the formal silences of the conference chamber. Those silences had edges. This one was more like water. Siveth, Oveth said eventually. Is that a word I should know? It is a word we use for, she paused. In your medicine, in your understanding of minds, is there a category for someone who holds a memory that has been formally resolved, who carries an official past thing as though it is still present? We have several, Essie said. Grief, trauma, mourning, depending on what's happening and how. Siveth is what we would call it, but for us it is another pause. The pauses were not uncertainty, they were accuracy. It is a condition, not in a cruel sense, but a condition that requires address. When a Threnodi engages in Siveth, their community intervenes. The memory is released through ceremony. The weight is set down. Essie ate another of the small cakes. The taste shifted slightly on the second one, became something adjacent to sweet. What if the person doesn't want to set it down? That is the nature of Siveth. The person does not want to set it down. That is why the community intervenes. The holding causes harm. Or, Essie said, not harshly, just placing the thought on the surface between them. The holding is the only honest response to what happened. Oveth looked at her. I'm trying to explain the memorial wall, Essie said. Do you want me to explain the memorial wall? Yes. At the memorial in Nairobi, this is for a different conflict, a very old one, but the principle holds. There's a wall with names on it, thousands of names. People go and they stand in front of it, and sometimes they touch the names of the people they lost. And what happens, what the wall does, it doesn't make the grief smaller, but it makes the grief legitimate. It says, this person existed. This person's absence is real, and it is real to other people, not only to you. The holding is not madness. The holding is the only sane response to an actual loss. Ovith was quiet for a moment. And without the wall, the loss is only inside you. And loss that lives only inside you starts to feel like something you invented. A silence. Ovith ate one of the small cakes with an economy of movement that was completely unhurried. My brother, Essie said, he was at Yanoba Station. She said it the way you set something down on a table, not gently, not roughly, simply with both hands in the place where it belonged. And then she did not say anything further about it. Ovith did not ask. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It held a different weight. Essie was aware, in a way she rarely was in professional rooms, of being in the company of someone who was actually present, not managing her, not strategizing around her, not calculating what her grief might mean for the negotiation. Simply present. Ovith sat across from her without moving, without speaking, for what Essie eventually counted as something near 4 minutes. Not uncomfortable, not performing patience. The way a person sits with someone when they have decided that sitting with them is enough. Essie had spent 20 years in rooms full of people. In conference chambers with polished tables and water carafes, and the subtle aggression of people performing neutrality. In debriefs and post-mortem sessions, and the quiet devastations of deals that cost more than they should have. She had been alone in all of those rooms in the way that has nothing to do with how many people are present. She was not alone in the dark now. Eventually, Ovith rose to leave. At the entrance to the widened corridor, she paused. The Accord, she said, we will meet again tomorrow. Yes. Corvalon does not understand what you are doing. He is trying. Another of those precise pauses. I am also trying. I know, Essie said. Thank you for the food. Ovith looked at her once more, and then walked back into the corridor, her footsteps making their small sound that was the beginning of something that chose not to finish. Essie sat in the recess space for a while longer. She held the carved weight in her hand, the gret she still did not have a name for, and she thought about walls with names on them and the people who stood in front of them, and she thought about her brother, whose name was Quame and whose absence was real, and she thought about the difference between resolution and healing, which had seemed like a clear difference when she arrived on the station, and which now felt like the most important question she had ever tried to explain to anyone. Ovith would record in the mission log she kept in her own language a single word, Sivith, and beside it for the first time in her life a question mark.